Hello everyone, my name is Xiomaro and welcome back to the channel. So today I want to do a little primer on getting started with Linux as a desktop OS, so that I can later do a guide to getting started with gaming on Linux. Just a warning, this video won't really contain much to do with gaming, but after I began making a guide to getting started with gaming, I realized that there was a lot of non-gaming stuff that people might need to get their head around first. By making this guide first, I can keep the gaming guide mostly about gaming and refer people back to this for everything that isn't gaming related. So the first thing you're going to need to understand if you're trying out Linux for the first time is that some things work differently. Contrary to popular but outdated beliefs, Linux isn't really very complicated to install or use. But just like switching between Windows and Mac OS, there are some key differences in the way you use your machine. Using the Windows and Mac OS example, many Windows users, when they first use Mac OS, try to close their programs by clicking the red button at the top of their window bar. On Mac, that doesn't actually fully close the program, it just closes any active projects, documents, or whatever, depending on the program you're using. Of course, anybody who's used a Mac before knows you need to use Command Q to properly close something. Does that make Mac OS stupid or unintuitive? No, it just makes it different to what you might expect if you've only ever used Windows. A lot of the same stuff applies when switching to Linux. One advantage with Linux is that it can behave more or less like Windows or Mac OS depending on the distro and desktop environment you choose. Some distros, such as Elementary OS, will feel quite familiar to a Mac user, while something like Linux Mint might feel a little more familiar to a Windows user. Personally, I don't think you should choose a distro based on what is most familiar, because honestly, there are still going to be some differences, so it almost lulls you into a false sense of security. Linux Mint and Elementary are both excellent distros, but I wouldn't choose either of them just because they look familiar. GNOME has become the default desktop environment in many of the most popular distros. It doesn't feel much like Windows or Mac, but don't let that put you off. At least in my opinion, I think it's very intuitive and user-friendly. It just takes a little bit of getting used to. But there are more differences than just the desktop environment. For example, the package manager. This is something that is quite different from how the average Windows or Mac user will obtain software. In my opinion, the way most Linux distros handle downloading, installing, and uninstalling software is far superior to the alternatives. But it might feel a little bit jarring to someone who is new to the OS. On Windows and Mac, yes, they do have a built-in store, so you might get some software from there, but for quite a lot of things you'll need to open your browser, go to the website of the software you're looking for, download a binary or whatever and install it. On Linux, your package manager handles all of that, including software updates. So if you need Firefox, you just download it through the package manager. If you need something more obscure, you might need to enable additional repositories, but then after you've done that, it will just work like anything else. That adding repositories part might feel a bit clunky, hacky, or unintuitive to a Windows user, but in reality, it's no more hacky or clunky than having to go to a website to download something. It's just that you're used to doing that. And the way most distros handle it is actually quite a lot more secure than trusting a third-party website as well. The bottom line is, most things you can do on Windows or Mac can be done on Linux. There might be a different way to go about it, and that actually brings me nicely to my next point. Be a problem solver. Honestly, I think this is something you need to learn to do regardless of which operating system you're using, but particularly for a less mainstream desktop OS like Linux, being able to Google your problems to find solutions is really important. As I mentioned before, some things might not seem intuitive at first, so if you get stuck, being able to search for answers is really useful. But the thing is, whatever OS you've come from, there will be quirks from that operating system that you instinctively just know through years of use. For example, everyone knows Control-Alt-Delete on Windows. Is that intuitive? Honestly, I don't think so, but it's something that most people know how to do when a program hangs and needs to be forced to close. If a program hangs and needs to be forced to close on Linux, it depends on your distro, but Control-Alt-Delete might not be the answer. That's something you're going to need to search for the first time it happens, but once you know how to do it, you know how to do it, so if it ever comes up again, it's not going to be a problem. If you choose your distro carefully, the problems you run into will mostly be easy to solve with a quick search. So I'm not saying you're going to have to up your computer competence tenfold, just be prepared to search for answers from time to time. If you are coming from Windows, another thing you need to be prepared for is that not everything will work, at least not exactly as you expect. If what you do is browse the web, play CSGO, and use Google Docs, Honestly, everything will work as expected. If, on the other hand, you want to use the Adobe suite and play, for example, Fortnite or Apex Legends, I'm afraid that's not going to work. Or, more accurately, getting it to work is going to be beyond many people. Technically, you can get any Windows software working through a virtual machine with nearly bare metal performance if you're using GPU pass-through. But not only does that require specific hardware, it's also going to require some technical knowledge. And at that point, the whole ease of use argument just goes out of the window. For most people, if you can't get your games working through Proton or Lutris, that just means you can't play them. The list of software that doesn't work on Linux is definitely shrinking, but there are still a number of things that are just not going to work on Linux. So if you need something for your work, or if you're the sort of person who needs to be able to play all the latest games, Linux might not be for you. However, I've kind of focused on the bad stuff first because I feel like it's important to be prepared, so let's move on to the positives. And here's one some people might not expect. Linux is actually easy to install. Honestly, the most complicated part of getting Linux set up is creating a bootable USB stick. But most distros have excellent guides on how to create a bootable USB. So while it's an extra step compared to having a pre-installed Windows system, it's something that most people should be capable of doing. Once you create a USB stick and boot into the Linux installer, it's actually very easy to install. Distros like Manjaro, Pop! OS, and others have very easy to understand installers, and most of them will even help you set up dual booting if you already have Windows installed. On top of that, a lot of your hardware will just work straight out of the box, and if it doesn't, many distros such as Manjaro and Pop! OS again make installing your graphics drivers and stuff like that super easy. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that this will be the case for everyone, but for me, getting my fresh Linux install ready to use is a lot quicker and easier than if I have to reinstall Windows. Of course, I do have some experience with Linux, so I know where to go for the more obscure drivers, such as for my mouse, but hey, if you'd never used Windows before, you'd have to search around a bit to figure that out too. And actually, I'll be covering stuff like getting your mouse driver set up when I do my more specific guide to gaming on Linux. It's not hard, so don't worry. Another benefit to Linux is flexibility and choice. I've mentioned all the different desktop environments and distros already. While there are only a handful that I would definitely recommend to new users, you do have a vast amount of choice. These choices mean you can have a setup that works best for you. With Windows, if you don't like the way something works, you're usually kind of stumped. And the same thing goes for Mac OS. There are some things you can change with Windows and Mac, but you're very limited compared to Linux. As I mentioned earlier, if you want a more Mac OS feel, you can go for something like Elementary OS. If you want bleeding edge software, you can go with a rolling release like Arch. And hell, if you want to install multiple desktop environments, you could do that. Why? Well, maybe you're just curious, maybe you prefer different workflows for different tasks, or need different features depending on what you're doing. And that brings me to my final point, speed and efficiency. Something you'll find with Linux is how fast and efficient it can be. It varies from distro to distro, but honestly, most distros are more lightweight than Windows. And because most distros are aimed at certain types of users, they'll usually only come with the stuff that you need. Or if they're more general purpose, they'll usually come with the basics, and you just install the extra stuff you need with the package manager. Windows, by comparison, gives you the kitchen sink. Not everyone wants or needs Cortana, gaming mode, automatic updates, and all that kind of stuff. But Windows gives you all of it, whether you like it or not. Some of the stuff can obviously be disabled, but honestly that's a bit of a faff, and it's one of the many ways Linux is more efficient. Having to make necessary changes to your system just to get it running as fast as possible is very inefficient. Most Linux distros take a much more focused approach, and for that reason you'll probably notice that things like boot and shutdown times are way faster on Linux, and you don't need to go into all your installed programs and remove bloatware. Another thing is, obviously it depends on the software and your needs, but something will actually run faster. As a personal example, I record my videos as MKVs and then remux them to MP4 for editing. OBS does that a hell of a lot faster on Linux. I have no idea why, but the difference is pretty substantial. As I mentioned earlier, not everything is going to be like this. Some things might be slower, but in the defense of Linux, a lot of that is down to software support. I guess to the end user, it doesn't matter why something works more slowly, but still. And of course, the customizability of your desktop means you can have the workflow you want. For example, a software engineer might find that a tiling window manager is more efficient for their workflow. Others might find KDE or XFCE works better for them. The point is, the choice is there, and that added efficiency is available to you. All in all, switching to Linux definitely comes with some fundamental changes to the way you use your computer, but there are some serious benefits to making the switch. Stay tuned for my Gaming on Linux guide that will be coming later this week. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please feel free to subscribe for more gaming guides, news, and discussion. And don't forget to check out the links below to Patreon, Discord, and Twitch. Until next time, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.